Thank you so much for inviting me. It's my first EdCog, and I'm really excited to be here and meet you all. So I'm here to share some of my research on brain-to-brain synchrony in the classroom. We know very little about how the human brain learns in the real world when we interact with one another. And the reason is that traditionally the tools that we use in cognitive neuroscience are limited to one participant at a time in a highly constrained environment. So consider a participant in a functional MRI study where they are being scanned in a noisy brain scanner, completely isolated from the external world, while they're being presented with images or sounds and so on. And clearly this kind of research is very valuable, but it's also very different than how real-world learning looks like. And in my research, I'm trying to bring neuroscience research outside of the laboratory box into the real world where students and teachers interact with one another face to face. Now, if you joined the visit to the live lab yesterday, I was there. I was amazed by the facilities here at Mac, and I'm really excited to share some of my research that clearly can be related to the type of research that can be done here at the live lab too. So I think it's useful to think about teaching and learning in the context of joint attention. So joint attention refers to our capacity to coordinate attention with a social partner. We typically think about joint attention in the context of human development, where infants can follow the direction of gaze or gesture of a caregiver, but it happens in classrooms too. How many of you have heard the sentence, "all eyes on me," or said that sentence if you're a teacher? So when a teacher says, "all eyes on me," what they mean is, please attend the same object that I'm attending, whether it's the whiteboard, another student speaking, or the teacher himself, and so on. So joint attention is clearly very important in classroom learning, and I'll return to that point later on in my talk. It's also useful to think about teaching and learning as a type of joint action, where teachers and students are expected to coordinate their behavior. And there is a growing body of literature that suggests that during joint actions, people become implicitly synchronized to one another at different levels. So think about two people on rocking chairs that tend to synchronize their movement as if the two chairs are mechanically coupled. Or quite remarkably, two musicians playing in a duet can achieve a higher degree of synchronization than the two hands of a single musician. And that happens in classrooms too. There is some evidence, not extensive yet, and in this talk I'll explore the following questions. Do students and teachers become synchronized not just in their behavior but also in their brain activity? Do they exhibit synchronized brain activity patterns? And if so, what kind of information we can extract from brain-to-brain synchrony between students and teachers? Can that tell us anything meaningful about how engaged students are, about their social dynamics in the classroom, and about learning outcomes? So this is the outline of my talk. I'll briefly talk about a series of 3 studies that my colleagues and I conducted both in classrooms and in the lab using portable EEG technology. And then I'll briefly share some of my ongoing and future work where we try to extend that approach also to online instruction. And finally, I would love to share some thoughts with you about how we can use the same technology not just to conduct research on students, but also research with students, where they become the investigators and get some authentic research experience within their own classroom. Okay. So in order to conduct this kind of research, we cannot use a very expensive and a non-portable MRI machine, but we can use portable EEG. EEG has been around for many, many years, so it's by no means a new technology. It's been around for nearly 100 years, both for basic research and for clinical purposes. But for the most part, EEG has been confined to laboratories, and this is due to the amount of time it takes to set up the equipment, the price tag, the amount of wiring, and so on. But more recently, portable EEG devices became available. This is one of them. I'm holding one of the devices that we used in the first two studies that I'll talk about today. This device has 14 channels, so much fewer than what we usually have in the lab, where the number of EEG channels ranges between perhaps 64 to 256. So this guy has only 14 channels. Clearly, the signal-to-noise ratio is not as good as lab equipment, but nonetheless, it's portable, it's very easy to use. You're welcome to talk to me later. I'm happy to show you how this guy works. And we can use it outside of the lab in classrooms on groups of students. And I'm really excited about using EEG in the context of educational research because I think that it can provide us with a unique source of information and complement very nicely other methods that we use. Specifically, EEG can provide us with implicit information about students' engagement and learning, the type of information that students might not be able to report using a survey. It provides us with continuous information. EEG has an amazing temporal resolution. We get millisecond by millisecond recording of students' brain activity without interrupting them. So we don't need to interrupt them every few minutes to give them a survey or a test, but rather we can collect this data continuously and analyze it, again, in addition to other sources of information. And finally, it can potentially be used in real time. And I'll return to that later on in my talk, where we're trying to use this data to predict in real time how engaged students are, and perhaps use this information to adapt the way information is being presented to students. That's further down the line, but we're making our first steps towards this goal. OK, so I mentioned a sequence of 3 studies. This is study number 1 that was initiated by my colleague, Susanna Dicker. And here we tracked a group of 12 high school students in a biology classroom. We actually joined this classroom for a full semester. We started the year by first introducing students to cognitive neuroscience. We trained them in using EEG equipment with the understanding that you cannot treat these students as the typical university student who comes into a study and you put on the EEG device, you give them a task, and then send them home. These students needed more preparation. And after that, we started collecting data from these students throughout 11 classes. And throughout these 11 classes, we looked at 4 different instruction activities where the teacher was either reading aloud from his lecture notes, kind of old school lecturing, or presenting the students with a short instructional video, leading a lecture, or a group discussion. And the first, and this is how the setup looked like. So this is a quick video where we're setting up the EEG devices on the students. The students were trained also to help one another. Very quickly, they were able to see their brain activity on the computer screen, which was a very engaging experience for them. And then once everyone was set up with the EEGs, we started collecting data. First, some baseline data where the students were just sitting quietly, and then the teacher who's sitting here started the lesson in the way that I just described. A few words about how we compute brain-to-brain synchrony. I'll keep it very quick, but again, I'm more than happy to provide more technical information later on or offline. So the process involves decomposing the EEG signal into different frequency bands. I assume that many of you heard about brain activity in the delta or theta or alpha band. And there is vast research on the cognitive and social properties that are associated with each one of these bands. For instance, I'll talk a lot today about the alpha band, which has been associated across many studies with attention and engagement. Interestingly, it's an inverse relationship. So when alpha goes up, attention goes down. That will be important later on. So the process involves decomposing the EEG signal into these frequency bands. And then within each frequency band, and for each pair of students, we compute their brain-to-brain synchrony. So if I'm the student here at the center, I'll compute my brain synchrony with each one of the other students in the classroom, and then average all these values together into what we call student-to-group brain synchrony. And that will be the main dependent measure in the next few studies. OK. So moving on to the results of study 1, we were interested in whether brain-to-brain synchrony can tell us anything meaningful about how engaged students are in a classroom environment. And as I mentioned, we had these 4 instructional activities. So we first asked students using a survey how engaged they were by each one of these activities. And this survey was administered at the end of each one of these 11 lessons, as well as the end of the entire semester. And perhaps not very surprisingly, I know that there are many teachers in the room, so you'd probably predict that without me showing the data, students were more engaged by videos and discussions compared to reading and lectures. So no big news here, but was quite striking was that we observed a very similar pattern for brain-to-brain synchrony between students, where brain synchrony was higher for videos and discussions compared to the other 2 instructional activities. And more importantly, these 2 metrics, engagement ratings and student-to-group brain synchrony, were significantly correlated. So here you see student self-reported engagement on the y-axis and student-to-group brain synchrony on the x-axis. And as you can see, these 2 are significantly correlated, meaning that students that were more engaged in a specific activity also exhibited higher brain-to-brain synchrony with their peers. So the take-home message here is that brain-to-brain synchrony can indeed predict self-reported student engagement. The way that we think about this data is that when students are not engaged in a specific classroom activity, their alpha brain activity goes up. And you can think about it in terms of mind wandering or other non-task-related processes. And under these conditions, we don't expect to see high brain-to-brain synchrony between the students. So low engagement often leads to low brain synchrony between students, just because each student is doing something else. And when students are highly engaged, there is suppression of this alpha brain activity that I mentioned, and that allowed students' brain waves to synchronize to an external stimulus. And this external stimulus can be the teacher's voice, it can be another student speaking, it can be a video that is presented on the screen. And under these circumstances, we do expect to see high brain-to-brain synchrony between the students. What about social dynamics? So I provided some evidence that brain synchrony is associated with how engaged students are, but can we also extract information about the social dynamics within the classroom? So if you recall from the video that I presented earlier, we had a condition where students were making eye contact with another student. So each time throughout these 11 classes, we randomly assigned the students to make eye contact with another student in the room. And so we could measure the brain-to-brain synchrony between these 2 students. And we could also ask these students how close they feel to one another. Importantly, this question about their social closeness was not asked until the very end of the semester. So while they were making eye contact, there was no cue, at least not on our end, on their social relationship. But nonetheless, it turns out that their brain-to-brain synchrony during this 2 minutes of eye contact was associated with how close they felt to one another, where pairs of students that felt closer to one another also reported or also exhibited higher brain-to-brain synchrony. And of course, this is a small sample of students. We only had 12, so this still needs to be replicated in larger samples. It's still preliminary, but I think that it's intriguing. It also aligns well with some recent functional MRI research that was done at Dartmouth, where they presented university students with short video clips inside an MRI brain scanner and showed that people that happened to be close friends processed these videos more similarly than complete strangers. So it seems that the way that we process information is somehow related to how close we are to one another. And this is also what came out of our data. So brain-to-brain synchrony predicted not just self-reported engagement, but also self-reported social closeness. In the second study, together with Dana Bevilacqua, we collaborated with another school. So that was a whole new group of students, another teacher, a completely different environment. And here, we wanted to test not just the students, but also the teacher. And this is, of course, challenging because, as you may know, EEG is very sensitive to movement and speaking artifacts. So we had to train the teacher. That took some time in teaching without moving too much. And during this time, we monitored the EEG data and made sure that we're getting usable data. And then we spent quite some time pre-processing the data, trying to minimize all the artifacts. And at the end of this process, we were able to get some usable data from the teacher and look not just at student-to-student brain synchrony, but also at teacher-to-student brain synchrony. And we were able to, I'm not going to show you this data for the sake of time, but we were able to replicate some of the findings from the first study where brain synchrony predicted engagement, but this time not just student-to-student, but also student-to-teacher brain synchrony predicted students' engagement. The one finding that I do want to share with you from this study that was recently published is that student-to-teacher brain synchrony predicted how close each student felt towards the teacher. And again, just like in study one, we didn't ask students to rate how close they feel to the teacher until the very end of the study. The brain data was collected during a lecture where the students were not prompted in any way to think about the relationship with the teacher, but somehow in the way that they process information during the lecture reflected how they felt towards the teacher, where students who felt closer to the teacher also showed higher brain-to-brain synchrony with their teacher. Again, it aligns well with the findings from study one and with these other recent fMRI results that I mentioned. So brain-to-brain synchrony was associated with student-to-teacher closeness. So to summarize just these two studies that I mentioned so far, so I hope to show you some evidence that classroom engagement is associated with brain-to-brain synchrony, where more synchrony is observed during teaching activities that were more engaging for students, like videos and discussions, and when students were more focused, according to their self-reports. And again, there is very little research like that in classrooms, but there is more EEG research that was done in the lab where people were just watching video clips or movies, and the findings were very similar, where brain synchrony was indicative of how engaged these people were with a video or a movie and so on. And the flip side of the coin is that brain synchrony is also associated with social dynamics. Specifically, we observed more synchrony between students who felt closer to one another and for students who felt closer to the teacher. We also have some interesting data on empathy and on what we call group affinity, how strongly students identify with social groups. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk more about it later. OK, so moving on to the third and last study that I'll talk about in this context. So in this study, we wanted to focus on the relationship between brain synchrony and learning. So do students retain more information when their brains are in sync? So far, I haven't addressed this question at all. So in order to answer that question, we conducted a new study, this time in the lab. And the reason for that was that we just got a grant and were able to purchase much more advanced EEG devices that have 32 channels. We used gel to get better signal-to-noise ratio. And we had hopefully less artifacts in the data due to this advanced equipment. So we wanted to first test it out in the lab before going back to a classroom, which is what we're doing these days. And this study was done with university students rather than high schoolers. We invited 4 students at a time to our laboratory classroom, and the students interacted with one another and with the teacher. They went through a sequence of 4 mini lectures. Each lecture was 7 minutes, roughly, in length. And the lectures were all related to biology and chemistry. Importantly, the students were non-science majors. So they had some background from high school, but very limited science background around these topics that were to be taught. And immediately after each lecture, there was a post-test where students were tested about the content. We also administered the very same test a week before the study as a pre-test and a week later. So we looked both at immediate memory retention and delayed memory retention. And I also want to acknowledge Henry Valk and Emma Laurent, who did a lot of the work around this study with me. And so overall, we had 31 students and 2 teachers who participated in this study. So one of the main questions that I was hoping to address in this study is what is the added value of looking across brains compared to looking at individual brains? As I mentioned, most research in cognitive neuroscience is done on individual participants, where you measure one participant at a time. And clearly, this line of research has been extremely valuable. So what do we gain by looking across brains, by looking at brain-to-brain synchrony, that you cannot gain by looking just at one participant at a time? So in this case, we compared brain-to-brain synchrony across students to intra-brain synchrony. By intra-brain, I mean synchrony within an individual brain. For instance, to what extent my frontal lobe is associated or correlated with my occipital lobe. This is a common measure that people use in the literature for other purposes, so we decided to use it here. We also looked at other individual brain measures. And across the board, whereas brain-to-brain synchrony significantly predicted delayed memory retention, that's what you see here in panel A, individual brain measures, like intra-brain synchrony, that's what you see in panel B, did not significantly predict memory retention. So the conclusion here was that brain-to-brain synchrony predicted learning better than individual brain measures. So we do gain information by looking across brains rather than looking within individual brains. And I can talk more later about what might be the reason behind this quite surprising finding. In addition to that, we were also interested in moment-to-moment variations in brain synchrony. So EEG, as I mentioned, has very high temporal resolution. We get millisecond by millisecond recordings of students' brain activity. What can we gain by this information? Typically, we average brain synchrony across a long duration, like a 7-minute lecture. But can we use a moving time window and try to reveal how brain activity changes over time? There might be moments in time when brain synchrony is high, other moments in time where it might be low. Do students learn better when their brain synchrony with their peers, with other students in the room is high rather than low? That was the question here. So in order to address that question, we took each one of these mini lectures, we transcribed it, and then for each one of the questions in the memory test, we identified when in the lecture the critical information to answer that question was provided. So for instance, we found out that in order to answer question 1, you needed to pay close attention between 1.5 minutes and 2 minutes into the lecture. So we had this information based on the lecture transcriptions, and then we computed brain synchrony within each one of these time windows rather than across the entire duration of the lecture. And the hypothesis was that for questions where students learned new information, so questions where they could not answer the question for the pre-test but could answer the question in the post-test, that's where we'll see higher brain synchrony compared to questions where students did not demonstrate learning, and that was exactly the finding. So brain synchrony was higher for questions where students demonstrated learning in green compared to questions where they did not demonstrate learning in red. And again, this is intriguing because this is very different than how we usually look at brain synchrony across a large duration of time. Here we looked at the moment-to-moment variations and found that they can indicate what specific information students can retain. And the last bit of information that I want to share with you from this third study is on student-to-teacher brain synchrony. So since in this case the teacher was always the speaker and the students were always the listeners, because that was a lecture where the students were specifically instructed not to ask questions. They could ask questions before or after, but not during the lecture, and that was for experimental purposes. So since that was the case, we anticipated that perhaps brain synchrony between students and teachers would be highest when the teacher is preceding the student in terms of their brain activity. So again, since the teacher is the speaker and the students are the listeners, we predicted that there's going to be a time lag between the teacher and the student where it might take some time for the student to process the information that has just been taught. And therefore, in order to capture this brain synchrony between the student and teacher, we might need to shift the teacher's brain activity backwards in time. We also consider the reverse, where perhaps students' brain activity precedes that of the teacher. And this might indicate students trying to predict what the teacher is about to teach them. So we considered both cases. And we asked at what time lag between the student and the teacher we get the maximal gain in terms of predicting students' learning. And that's what you see here in this graph. So this graph shows you the correlation between student-to-teacher synchrony and memory retention as a function of the temporal lag between the student and the teacher, where negative values mean that the teacher precedes the student, positive values mean that the student precedes the teacher. And as you see, the peak here was at about minus 200 milliseconds. So when the teacher preceded the student by about 200 milliseconds, that's when we saw the highest correlation with students' learning, which again makes sense because the teacher was speaking and it took some time for this information to be processed by the student. But we had a hunch that that might not be the case for all EEG locations. So perhaps this is the case overall, but what happens on an electrode by electrode basis? And that's what you see here with this heat map. So this heat map shows you the lag for each one of these EEG channels that produce the highest correlation with students' learning. And positive lags that correspond to student proceeding are in yellow or orange, and blue corresponds to negative lags, again, that mean that the teacher was preceding the student. And you see that most of these electrodes are blue, which means that the teacher was indeed preceding the student as we anticipated, but some of these EEG locations are actually orange, which correspond to the student preceding the teacher. So intriguingly, central and frontal electrodes showed the reverse pattern to what I just described, where the correlation between student-to-teacher synchrony and delayed retention peaked when the student's brain activity preceded the teacher's. And again, I want to be careful here, but one interpretation is that this corresponds to the students trying to predict what is about to be taught. And there is some research showing that this ability of listeners to predict what is about to be said is associated with better comprehension. So that's something that our brains are trained to do very well, predict the environment, and students that might be engaged in predicting what is about to be taught more often might learn more effectively. That's an open question, but an interesting one according to this data. Okay, so to summarize this sequence of 3 studies, so I hope to show you some evidence that brain-to-brain synchrony in the classroom is associated with how engaged students are in studies 1 and 2. Brain synchrony, but not individual brain measures, can also predict learning, both immediate and delayed memory retention. That was the conclusion of study 3. And moment-to-moment variations in brain synchrony can indicate what specific information students can retain. Okay, so what did we learn about brain-to-brain synchrony? So at the very basic level, brain synchrony is probably driven by the presence of an external stimulus. So you can think about the stimulus as the teacher's voice or a video that is played on the screen. And there is a lot of research on what we call entrainment that shows that our brains can entrain or become coupled to an external stimulus. This has been known for a while. And in a classroom environment, one might expect that all the students become entrained to the same stimulus if they're all exposed to the same lecture or the same video and so on. But what this data suggests is that on top of this very basic level, brain-to-brain synchrony is also modulated by attention, where students that pay more attention, that are more engaged, show higher brain synchrony with their peers. So it goes above and beyond just basic stimulus entrainment. And even more so, brain synchrony is also modulated by social factors, like how close students feel to one another, how close they feel towards a teacher. If brain synchrony was purely stimulus entrainment, we wouldn't expect to see these effects, where it's also modulated by attention and by other social factors. OK, so part 2, going to be much quicker than part 1, is on ongoing work and future directions. So as I mentioned, I'm very interested in trying and extend this approach to online learning, given how important and common online learning is in higher ed. So when we concluded this study that I just talked about, we videotaped all these lectures, and we presented them to another sample of students. So the students came to the lab individually, watched the same material as if they are taking an online course. And importantly, these two samples, the face-to-face and online samples, were age and gender matched, primarily university students. So we are very interested, we're now analyzing the data to see how students' brain synchrony and other brain measures were modulated by this manipulation. Behaviorally, we found that students learn better online compared to face-to-face. It's not a huge effect, but it's nonetheless significant. So you see that both for immediate and delayed memory retention, the online sample learned better than the face-to-face sample. And since this is the case, now it becomes even more interesting to look under the hood and see what the EEG data might tell us about students' brain dynamics when they are being taught face-to-face compared to online. We also had eye tracking data. So we asked our students in the online study to put on these portable eye trackers, and we could follow their gaze as they were watching these video lectures. And you see how they transition from looking at the instructor to reading some of the text on the slide. One interesting finding here is that students who looked more at the teacher throughout this video lecture learned better than students who did not look at the instructor that much. And I find that interesting. And perhaps the most ambitious goal of this line of research is to try and use this EEG data in real time to predict students' engagement, and perhaps also try and close the loop and modify the way information is being presented to students based on their brain activity. This is clearly science fiction at the moment, but I feel that it's a good goal to have. And this is how it looks like. So we have an undergrad student in this case who led this study with me, Or Dagan. He's watching a video lecture while his brain activity is being recorded with his more advanced EEG device. So what you see on the screen is the ongoing EEG recordings while O is watching the video lecture on this tablet computer. And occasionally throughout this lecture, as you'll see in a sec, there are questions that pop out, and they prompt O to rate how engaged he is at this specific moment in time. You'll see that in just a sec. And they also ask O some content questions, so a true or false question about something that has just been taught in the video. And once or provides the questions, the answers to these questions, the video resumes. And so we started by just interspersing these questions randomly throughout the lecture. But the goal is to use machine learning and try and develop an algorithm that can perhaps predict students' engagement based on their brain activity and interrupt them at the specific moments in time where we suspect that they disengage. And hopefully by presenting these true or false questions, we can perhaps re-engage the students with the material and help them learn better. Of course, that's an open question, lots of technical challenges. As I mentioned, EEG is very noisy, and when you try to do this analysis in real time, you cannot really clean the data sufficiently as you would in a traditional EEG experiment. So we're still at the beginning of this research program, but nonetheless, I find it really exciting. Okay, so last part. So how can we use this technology to engage students in authentic research? Being not just a researcher, but also an educator, I felt very strongly that if we go to schools and ask for this buy-in from students and teachers, we should also give something back in the form of allowing the students to conduct their own investigations. So when we were done collecting data for the very first study that I mentioned today, we flipped the table and asked the students to take the lead, and they became the investigators. We gave them the equipment, and we were there to mentor them in the process of creating their own mini EEG experiments. And that led to an NIH-funded 5-year program that we are now conducting on authentic neuroscience research in schools. And this is led by Steven Azika, who is a former science teacher, and he's now working with me on this program. So a few words of background about authentic research in STEM classrooms. We know that current practices of inquiry-based learning in high school classrooms are very different than how authentic research is being conducted. Students are often not involved in developing their own research questions, but rather they are given questions by their teacher. Students are typically asked to follow cookbook-style laboratory procedures. They don't develop their own methods. And perhaps most importantly, the outcomes of these investigations are usually known in advance. So this is mostly done to perhaps demonstrate scientific content rather than introduce students to the open-ended nature of scientific inquiry. And I'm interested in bringing neuroscience to K-12 classrooms and engage students in authentic research. And I think that there are great reasons to do that. Neuroscience is perhaps the fastest growing field in STEM, but nonetheless, at least in the US, it's almost completely absent in K-12 education. Neuroscience research can, in my experience, provide a gateway into engaging young students in science. In over 10 years of teaching neuroscience in schools, I can tell you that students are intrinsically interested in neuroscience because they can easily relate to the content. It's about how their own brain works, how they form memories, how they learn in schools, their personality, and so on. And I feel that that can be a very powerful hook to engage students not just in neuroscience, but also in science in general. Being interdisciplinary, we can introduce cross-cutting concepts that students can then apply to many other science fields. And after David's talk yesterday that was related to growth mindset, there is also research showing that teaching students about brain plasticity can enhance their growth mindset. So I feel that there are many other reasons that I could have put here, but each reason by itself is important enough to bring more neuroscience into K-12. And that led us to the Brainwaves program. So in the Brainwaves program, students are first introduced to this world of cognitive neuroscience. It's all done in a hands-on, inquiry-based way. They go through a series of labs and experiments to learn about neurons. They dissect sheep brains to learn about brain anatomy. They learn about how the brain interacts with the external world. And based on this knowledge, in Unit 2 of the curriculum, they become the investigators. Each school is paired to a science mentor, typically either a PhD student or a postdoc that visits the school regularly on a weekly basis, and they help the teacher mentor the students in this process. We also developed an app. It's called the Brainwaves app, where students are able to first enter the research question and hypothesis and then design a mini experiment. So they can ask questions like, how does music affect learning? Or how does playing computer games might affect my attention levels, and so on. So they can collect data, that's what you see here. This can either be just behavioral data, so information on reaction time or accuracy, or students can actually use the very same portable EEG devices that I showed you earlier to collect some brain data. In this case, these students were interested in how video games might affect their brain activity. And then through this app, students can analyze their data, and at the end of the program, we invite them to come to NYU and share their results. And we recently launched the Brainwaves journal, where students can also publish their work. And this work gets peer-reviewed by other students from other schools. So really try to give the students this authentic experience, research experience, from coming up with their own research question all the way down to sharing their results with their community. Of course, this couldn't have been done without an amazing team of teachers and science mentors. We trained them over the summer. We're just about to train the second cohort of teachers. We're in 10 public schools every year. And so we have summer courses and 5 PD days throughout the school year. And as I mentioned, teachers and scientists are implementing the program together. This is just a subset of the many teachers and mentors that are involved. And we also have an ongoing evaluation study where we look at things like students' content knowledge, but more importantly, their understanding of the scientific method and their attitudes towards STEM. And we use both quantitative as well as qualitative approaches to assess that. Just to give you a brief look into the data, so this is still preliminary, but here we ask students to rate their current level of understanding or skill in terms of their neuroscience knowledge and in terms of being able to conduct science research. And that was done both pre and post. And you see significant increases in both. And we have now more data from interviews that we're analyzing and so on. And the results look quite promising. And with that in mind, I want to conclude with some final thoughts about neuroscience and education. So this is a controversial topic. About 20 years ago, John Brewer published a paper with the title "A Bridge Too Far," claiming that it's just impractical to try and build bridges between neuroscience and education. Perhaps these bridges should go through psychology, which makes a lot of sense to me. But a direct bridge between neuroscience and education is just too far. That was the claim 20 years ago. Many people think that way also today. But there are many other people that think otherwise and try to push the idea that perhaps neuroscience research can inform education research, perhaps even be used to improve education at some point. There are papers like Neuroscience and Education, Prime Time to Build a Bridge, an ideal partnership in the 21st century, from research to practice, but also very critical pieces like this 2016 paper, which pointed some very important or potentially important practical and principled problems in educational neuroscience. So this is still controversial. Nonetheless, there is a lot of interest in that. And this is reflected in new journals and conferences and research centers and so on. On the other hand, when we go to the educational field, we find all these supposedly brain-based approaches like Brain Gym that tries to teach students and students and teachers how to coordinate their hemispheres, and this is based on pretty much zero scientific research. But nonetheless, when you put the word brain in your title, that sells, right? So I feel very passionate about engaging in this conversation with educators and talking to them about what we do know about the brain, what we do not know about the brain. That's just as important. And helping them identify what is research-based and what is not. And that led me, as Joe mentioned, to start the Neuroscience and Education Collaborative at NYU, and I just want to give a quick shout out. We're going to have, we just got funding to organize a 2-day meeting in January. So if you feel like coming to New York City and engaging in this conversation with researchers, teachers, policymakers, parents, funders, please join us. This is a link to our website. You can join the mailing list and you'll be informed when we have more information about the program. So I'll put this slide back in just a sec. I just want to conclude with asking us all if we are on the same brain wavelength. So notice these 5 metronomes, sorry. They're first off sync, so they each tick at a different frequency. But notice what happens when they are placed on these two cans. They all become synchronized. Hopefully, by now, we're all synchronized too, I would hope. And with that, I want to acknowledge the many people who contributed to this work, and thank you so much for your attention.
I have a whole list of questions I want to ask you. One question I had was that so social interaction is very important, and brain-to-brain synchrony sounds like a really interesting dependent measure to look at. From a practical perspective for a teacher, should students always be assigned to the same seat so that they develop these relationships, or should they always be seated in a novel seating arrangement and have to interact with different people?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I can answer it, but I'll try. So in the first study that I mentioned, the classroom study, we actually randomly assigned students to different seats each time. We found that their their physical distance actually played a role. So students that were seated close to one another, it wasn't a huge effect, but it was nonetheless significant, did show higher brain-to-brain synchrony with one another, which I find interesting. So the way that we seat students in a classroom might have an effect on their brain activity. I can see pros and cons to either mixing it up each time and allowing students to form new connections, or keeping the same seats. I guess that it really depends on your goals as an educator, perhaps the content area and so on, the type of activities that students are expected to engage in and so on. But we probably, we need more data on that for sure.
Hi, Ido. Thanks for a great talk. I'm going to throw a question at you that's totally out of left field. So a lot of what we've seen at this conference so far, and a lot of in the education and memory literature, is dealing with learning basic skills or knowledge. What if we're hoping our students are sort of building connections with other information they already have, or kind of making creative new connections with other material? I know that this ties in kind of the burgeoning creativity work. It's not as kind of known of a research history, but in terms of what if the student is mind-wandering, but it's because they're making these sort of connections with previous work and it's tying it in, and actually it's that kind of desirable difficulty idea, like it's going to take them a bit longer to get there, but once they get there, they have this big sort of scaffolded idea of the broader field of biology or something. So in every case, would it be best for us to be kind of stopping somebody's thought process as you see them not paying attention to bring them back to what's being viewed? I don't know. Again, this is totally left field. I don't know if the data speaks to it, but have you thought about this or,
Yeah, thank you for asking that. That's a great question. I ask this question myself all the time. Like, do we necessarily want our students to be synchronized to one another and to the teacher? Is that a good thing? Well, the first point that I want to make is that when I say brain-to-brain synchrony, I don't mean a perfect correlation. It's very far from that. So perhaps it's in the order of 5 to 10% of their brain activity is synchronized to either another student or to the teacher. So it's a small effect. It's nonetheless significant, and it can tell us something important about students' engagement and learning. But by no means I mean that students and teachers' brainwaves go up and down in perfect synchrony. That's far from being the case. We don't want that to be the case. I think that in some cases, for creative thinking, we might want students to become desynchronized rather than synchronized. When it comes to mind wandering, there is research that, clearly if we mind wander, there should be a good reason why that happens, right? Otherwise, evolution should have taken care of that. And I attended a session at AERA exactly on that, and there is research showing that mind wandering can actually be a good thing, and we don't want to necessarily prevent our students from mind wander. They might engage in some off-task processing and then go back to the topic and so on. So yeah, going back to this study that I mentioned where we want to perhaps detect disengagement and interfere, yeah, I do have this concern that we're not serving the students well because we're interrupting with a process that should occur. So that's an open question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that talk. My name is Sriya Murthy, and I'm actually did my PhD in neuroscience and education from the Cambridge University. And I know one of the biggest critiques that we have is that all of these studies are done in the lab and the brain is isolated. So something like brain-to-brain synchrony or the live lab allows us to go from a live lab to the classroom setting. But I also find that cognitive scientists are kind of hesitant to apply and share their knowledge to the broader schools. So like conferences like these are amazing in bridging that gap. Do you find that researchers are open to studies like yours, and how do you find it in the classrooms? And I think it's amazing that you're already applying and getting your high school students to do the research as well.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a mixed bag. I feel that there is a lot of excitement on one hand, there is some skepticism on the other hand, like with many new things, right? So I engage a lot with high school teachers in New York, and I can say that across the board, teachers are very interested in this kind of work and want to learn more about neuroscience in general. But then when you ask, some perhaps educational researchers might claim that it's irrelevant to talk to teachers or with teachers about brain science because it cannot directly inform the way that they teach. We have probably many educators in the room, right? So I'll let you decide for yourself. I hope that you find this information useful. The teachers that I engage with definitely find it useful. And this whole debate about neuroscience and education, whether this connection is important or not, I don't find this discussion necessarily very helpful to move the field forward. Yeah, but I'm happy to talk more about it offline if you'd like.
Hi, thanks for a beautiful talk. It's really nice. It's my first time here, so it's nice to find a sandbox where we can have the same toys to play with. So thank you. I'm going to ask that we think about the toys of the future, and your allude to the human-brain interface and the tools that might intercede to make learning potentiate through modern technology. What do you envision in the next 10 or 20 years if money was no option?
Yeah. Oh, that's a fun question to answer. Thank you. Yes, I think that these devices are going to get so much better. They're going to get smaller, more portable, even cheaper. There is already an EEG device that goes around your ear. So that can potentially be interesting. I'm not really sure what kind of information we can get from around the ear. Usually with EEG, we want to place electrodes on other parts of the head, but nonetheless, it's intriguing. And once these devices get smaller and less obtrusive, we can use them more widely, right? I don't necessarily think that we're going to find these devices in every single classroom. We probably don't need that, but I do think that this kind of research hopefully will become more common. And perhaps if we think about online learning, that's one domain where I think that this kind of technology has a lot of potential, where imagine that you sign up for an online course and you get this mini EEG kit in the mail, you put it on, it's very easy, it takes a minute or so, and this data then feeds into the online software and can be taken into account, as well as other sources of information like learning analytics and so on. So I feel that that's where I would love to see this technology developing in the next few years.
Just to follow that just for a quick sec, would you include Synchrony as the dependent measure, or are there other things that you think might be important?
Yeah, thank you. So we're looking into that these days. So we have a study where we look both at just straight up individual brain measures like alpha, power, compared to brain synchrony. As I mentioned in study 3, we do have a reason to believe that brain synchrony might work better than other measures, but we do want to replicate that. Especially when you look at things in real time, that changes things. So I'm not sure that synchrony will work that well in real time. Perhaps just power estimates will be more robust to artifacts. We don't know that yet. Yeah.
Very interesting talk.
Thank you.
And I think this was prompted by study one. I'm not sure if it applies as much to the other ones, but could the students, when they're making their self-reports about how engaged they were they seeing their brain activity during that lecture or during that class?
Yeah, they do not. They only saw their brain activity briefly when they put on the device, because we need to make sure that all the electrodes make good connection and just visually inspect the data. But then we take away these computers and they just engage with the teacher the way that they would normally.
Yeah. I wasn't sure whether it was something they could see throughout and then maybe that was influencing them saying how engaged they were.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Okay, so I just have one other quick question. It's more just sort of a curiosity question. So you talk about the EEG can collect things continuously, and most of the work I do is with thought probes, and we have to think about, okay, how often or how many do we want to have? And it's very nice to have that sort of continuous thing. Do you think learning happens on a similar time scale? You know, like, can you find millisecond to millisecond evidence of learning? Or
Yeah.
I'm just sort of curious what you think, what level that's going on.
So that's an empirical question. I don't think that it's millisecond by millisecond, but definitely second by second. And in this study that I briefly mentioned, the online study where we try to predict students' engagement, we actually manipulate the length of the time windows. So we consider just 1 second of EEG data compared to 5 seconds, 10 seconds prior to when the probe was presented. And we want to figure out what is the correct time scale to look at. It's tricky because it's also confounded with how good the data is, and when you integrate data over an extended period of time, you'll just get better estimates, right? So it's a bit tricky, but nonetheless, we hope to look into that with the data that we're collecting these days.
Thank you.
Sure.
This is the last question of the session.
So thank you very much. Have you done any work with really diverse classes? So I'm thinking international versus domestic students, first of all, or neurotypical and neurodiverse?
Yeah, great. Not yet. We're still in the beginning. So far, we worked with small groups of students because we were limited by the amount of devices that we had and so on. My colleague, Susanna Dicker, who I mentioned, she's interested in looking at bilingual students and perhaps comparing students learning in English and Spanish and so on. We might look at some learning differences down the line. We haven't done that just yet. Thank you.
If you could take one more speculative and provocative question. There's a lot of Ontario universities, and I'm on one such committee that's looking at teaching evaluations that are used in university courses. There's a lot of controversy about them, how reliable and valid they might be. So I'm just thinking about this brain-to-brain synchrony between the teacher and the student. Could that be a possible measure of teaching effectiveness?
Well, I didn't really think about that. It's really intriguing to think about it. Might work, I don't know. We did consider using that for teacher training purposes, where a teacher is giving a lecture and they get some online feedback about their brain synchrony with their students, and perhaps that feedback can be useful. Or in online learning where you don't really see your students, right? Getting some information about how engaged they might be can be very meaningful. I'm a bit hesitant about using that for assessment purposes, but
That's fair.
possibly.
We are filming this, though. All right. Thank you very much.